AMD hasn't had much to compete with Team Green on since the 6000 series RDNA 2 lineup, which has for the most part been pretty successful, with arguably the best cards in terms of value for money being around the 6700 series, perfect for 1440p gaming including higher refresh gamers alike. And with today seeing the launch of both the 7800 XT at $499 and the seemingly cut down 7700 XT at $449, kind of opens up an interesting proposition, especially considering the 4060 Ti 16GB which launched for $499 and has been a bit of a flop. And in response to AMD, they've actually seen prices kind of tumble closer to match that of the 7700 XT. But at $50 cheaper than the 7800 XT, do we lose an equal amount of performance, or is this a simple bait and switch move from AMD in the hope of selling the slightly expensive older brother? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32GB of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Now, normally in the past, we've seen AMD make some shady moves with refreshes upon refreshes, but it does seem like they're slowly getting better and channeling their inner consumer and seeing it from a typical gamer's perspective. So due to this, when I heard they were announcing two GPUs aimed at, I guess, the relatively same market, I was a bit perplexed. Was the lower tier card going to be a GPU core that didn't maybe make the cut and then would be palmed off as something else, or was there a bit more to it than that? Luckily, there is a bit more to it than that, though both the 7700 XT and 7800 XT are based upon the Navi 32 GPU. But it is a slightly different variant, with the 7700 XT sporting the XL and the 7800 XT utilising the XT variant, though both come in with the same 346mm squared die size, but that's where a lot of the similarities end. Packing 3,456 shading units, 216 texture mapping units, 96 ROPs, 54 compute units and the same for RT cores and 48 MB 3 cache, the specs look to be pretty impressive, and only slightly under the 7800 XT specs, and 35% higher in shading units, texture mapping units, compute units and RT cores when compared to the 6700 XT, along with 50% more ROPs, though strangely it actually features 50% less L3 cache. Though as we've seen before, generation to generation sometimes sees a change in the subsystem and architecture which allows lower amounts of cache. Another key area that has seen a change, which has been one of the largest kind of hot topics as of late, is the memory, where the 7700 XT still features 12GB of GDDR6 like its predecessor and on a 192-bit bus, but the bandwidth has actually been increased by 12%, from 384GB per second up to 432. Now, one thing that is interesting though is that generally we would see a lot of work being done on efficiency, but compared to its RDNA 2 counterpart, the 7700 XT's TDP has actually been increased from 230 watts on the 6700 XT up to 245 watts, which in a world of ever rising electricity costs, it seems to be a bit of a weird move. Now for the 7700 XT, AMD aren't actually sampling NBA models from what I can tell, and instead have relied on their AIB partners to help seed samples, which is where the likes of XFX, Sapphire and Gigabyte all came through with cards for us to look at. And as we know, in terms of raw performance, they will all perform within a margin of each other. So for the purposes of this review, we'll be putting our focus on the QICK or QICK 319 model from XFX, but we will be showing cooling performance on all three of the cards that we have here today. Now before we talk about each individual card, let's get into the performance of the 7700 XT as a GPU in terms of raw performance. And that's where we put the XFX card onto our GPU test bench with an Intel Core i9 12900K on an Asus Maximus Z690 Hero motherboard with 32GB of Patriot Viper 6200MHz dual channel memory. All testing was done on Windows 11, and along with a couple of synthetic benchmarks, we also tested 15 games in total and some ray tracing and upscaling tests on top of that. We'll also be looking at all resolutions today and seeing how things compare overall, and then finishing off by looking to see what kind of bang for buck the 7700 XT is actually able to give. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with some synthetic benchmarks and Timespy Extreme, and straight away when looking at the generational uplift from the 6700 XT, we start to see a pretty sizable 30% more performance on the 7700 XT. Though the 7800 XT gives us another 16% more performance for 11% more cost. So it's going to be an interesting one to see how close the two RDNA 3 GPUs come out in other tests. In Port Royal, we can clearly see the large uplift that the 7700 XT has in ray tracing, with 41% more performance from its predecessor, and now coming in 1% stronger than the 6800 XT, which isn't a lot, but considering this is a different class card, it's not a bad start at all. Moving over to our first game, and a Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p already gets things off to a good start, with 37% more frames than the 6700 XT, and now sitting equally with the 6800 XT, a card that even now is more expensive brand new than the 7700 XT is coming out at. This also puts the RDNA 3 card 10% ahead of Nvidia's 4060 Ti, further showing the frankly terrible prospect that it is for the money, as the 16GB will perform very similar anyway. At 1440p, again the newer card gives us a strong uplift of 41% over the 6700 XT, and now again is matched with the 6800 XT, and sits not too far behind the RTX 4070 from Nvidia. At 4K, the likes of the 6700 XT were pretty much at an unplayable level, though the newer 7700 XT gives hope with 46% more performance, now at 49 FPS, and sitting very close to the performance of the 6800 XT and RTX 4070. Dialing in the settings a little could see some strong performance at 4K in this game. As we move up to Call of Duty, AMD have a strong favour here, and the 7700 XT does well at 1080p, demonstrating a huge 40% uplift over the 6700 XT and 11% more performance compared to the RTX 4070, and also sitting just ahead of the 3090 Ti, a card that once cost $2,000 at launch. Moving up to 1440p, and again strong numbers coming in with a 45% margin over its predecessor, the 6700 XT, and now sitting just ahead of the 6800 XT. Also, compared to the RTX 4070, the newest RDNA 3 GPU commands another 11% more performance, and for a lesser price. 4K on the 6700 XT was at a level that would be deemed unplayable, but thanks to 33% more performance, the 7700 XT is a card that can play COD at 4K on ultra settings at 69 FPS. This also puts it just ahead of the 6800 XT and 11% ahead of Nvidia's RTX 4070. Moving over to Control, and at 1080p we again see some good numbers, with the 7700 XT packing 38% more performance compared to the previous gen, which puts it close to the RTX 4070 and 6800 XT, trailing behind by just 3%, which isn't bad considering its cost. The gains keep on coming at 1440p, where the newer RDNA 3 GPU comes in with 35% more performance compared to its older brother, the 6700 XT. And again, this puts it close to the RTX 4070, sitting behind by just 6%, which when comparing the cost difference of the 4070 coming in 33% more expensive, it's all looking good for Team Red. Then at 4K, the 7700 XT gives us another 40% more performance up from last generation, and again puts it within the realms of playable frame rates, with a little bit of tweaking to the settings. Again, it falls just behind the RTX 4070, but puts up a strong fight along the way, especially considering the cost. Now, without sounding like I'm repeating myself, the performance uplift in Cyberpunk is pretty impressive too, with 32% more frames gen to gen, and putting the 7700 XT just ahead of the 6800 XT. Though as we move up the chart, it's clear to see, based on the positioning of the RTX 4080 for instance, that some severe bottlenecking is going on here. 1440p shows a strong uplift too of 38%, which means that the cheaper 7700 XT is now pretty evenly matched to the RTX 4070, with just a single frame separating them. For a card that is so much more expensive, the AMD card makes Nvidia look pretty inferior. Cyberpunk sees a larger increase in performance from the RDNA 2 to RDNA 3 GPUs of 42%, though in such a demanding game at 4K on the Ultra preset, it's not what I deem as playable, but again does match the performance of the RTX 4070, further instilling the potential great value of this card. in Doom Eternal at 1080p on Ultra Nightmare, and we again see some pretty impressive figures at over 400 frames per second, which also is 22% better than what the RDNA 2 equivalent scored, though this does mean that the likes of the RTX 4070 sits 12% faster, but for 33% more money, it really isn't worth it. At 1440p we see a slightly larger gain over the 6700 XT of 26% and with some strong figures, though the 6800 XT and RTX 4070 both sit ahead, but again, not by enough to warrant the extra outlay of cash. At 4K we see our smallest gain yet when comparing the 6700 XT and 7700 XT of just 18%, which is still welcome, don't get me wrong, but when the likes of the RX 6800 is beating it and can be had for $20 less brand new, it's not a great look for the newest GPU on the market, though this is only in one game so far. Moving on to Dying Light 2, and the gains are there but are much smaller still, with just a 17% increase from the previous generation, though again this puts it right on the heels of the RTX 4070, which is starting to look pretty inferior overall. The improvement at 1440p is larger at 20% gen to gen, and again not too far behind the RTX 4070, a card that is wildly more expensive for very similar performance, so I guess another win for Team Red. Then at 4K the 7700 XT comes in with 17% more performance compared to the 6700 XT, but at just 41 FPS it's not breaking any records, and is definitely more suited for the lower resolutions in this title. Hogwarts Legacy is a pretty demanding game, but it's able to harness the potential of the RDNA 3 architecture well, with 27% more frames than the previous gen, which also puts it 5% ahead of the more expensive RTX 4070. The 7700 XT packs another 23% more performance at 1440p and now sits level with the RTX 4070, though with somewhat more impressive 1% low figures, which shows one of two things: either the 7700 XT is exceptional in comparison to Nvidia, or that the RTX 4070 is just terrible. At 4K we do still see a 20% increase in performance from the RDNA 2 based counterpart, but that only equates to 6 frames per second, and leading into unplayable territory, though again it only sits just behind the Ada Lovelace based RTX 4070. Moving on to Spider-Man Remastered, and at 1080p the results are frankly all over the place, with some severe bottlenecking occurring to the likes of the RTX 4080, 4070 Ti and even potentially the 7700 XT, among many other cards. No matter what you choose, 1080p in this game will be a breeze, but the 7700 XT is a 1440p card, so the results should line up a little better there. They do, and things are back to normal with a 21% increase over the 6700 XT, putting performance just below the 6800 XT, though the RTX 4070 finds a new lease of life and is now coming in 18% faster at 1440p. Then at 4K we see a similar 22% improvement over the 7600 XT's predecessor, the 6700 XT, and this now gives us identical performance to the RX 6800, but as this card isn't aimed at 4K gaming, it's not a massive point anyway. Microsoft Flight Sim sees some terrible numbers across the board, but we've come to expect that from such a demanding game, though we do still see an increase in performance from the last generation of just 7%. I honestly wasn't expecting much here, but I guess anything is welcomed. 1440p is more like it, now with the 7700 XT coming in 41% faster than its older brother, and also coming in very close again to the RTX 4070, and in a turn up for the books, matching the performance of the other newest RDNA 3 based GPU, the 7800 XT. 4K isn't really worth commenting on, as unless you're rocking the best of the best with an X3D CPU or willing to use frame generation, you're going to struggle. Though I will say that the 7700 XT positions itself exactly where we'd expect. Lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, uplift on the 7700 XT from its predecessor is a little less at just 17%, but is still very much welcomed, as this means it sits ahead of the RX 6800 and not too far behind the RTX 4070. At 1440p, that gain increases yet again to a 28% uplift over the 6700 XT, which again has the 7700 XT sitting very close to the RTX 4070, only being separated by 2 FPS, but offering a much better value proposition. Then, finishing things off at 4K, the 7700 XT is now coming in with 37% more frames than the model before, which also puts it just behind the 6800 XT, but more importantly just ahead of the more expensive RTX 4070. So being honest, I think everyone had a good idea as to how the 7700 XT was going to perform, but there's still some good points to talk about. The first being the increase in performance over the 6700 XT, which at 1080p we do see an increase of 19%, which isn't bad considering the $479 price tag that the RDNA 2 GPU came in at for launch, though can obviously be had somewhat cheaper now. More interestingly, the RTX 4070 isn't as ahead as first thought, with only a 5% lead between them. Though it's very hard to ignore how much further up the chart the 7800 XT is, a card that is only $50 more expensive. 1440p is where this card is based though, and that's where we should be looking at, though the position of all the cards are practically identical. The 7700 XT still has a 25% margin over the previous gen equivalent, and this puts it just ahead of the RX 6800 and just behind the RTX 4070. Looking at each game, the 7700 XT put up a good fight against the RTX 4070 and only fell behind at 1440p by 7%, which is pretty impressive overall considering the price points. Now, while the card isn't aimed at 4K gaming, it was clear to see that certain titles can be played on the 7700 XT and with an average FPS of over 60, depending on the game. So it may be achievable, but some settings may have to be reined in to make the gameplay a bit more of a fluid experience. Now, rasterization is just one element of a GPU, and as we know, Nvidia have put a big focus onto ray tracing and upscaling technology, and typically AMD have generally been behind in those departments, though what we do see here is strong performance gains of 40% when moving up from RDNA 2, and this further puts the 7700 XT ahead of Nvidia's 4060 Ti. Though admittedly we didn't have the 16GB to test, though performance in this title should be similar to what's seen from the 8GB card. What's more interesting though is how the 7800 XT comes out much stronger and closer to that of the RTX 4070, and is only $50 more expensive than the 7700 XT. In Cyberpunk, the 7700 XT isn't a card that you'd be running with ray tracing turned on without any form of upscaling. Luckily, turning upscaling on does see a sizable improvement that almost hits 60 FPS, and again, with a few tweaks here and there, you could see that further increase in sacrifice for some of those fancy visuals. Though the lesser cost 4060 Ti does outperform it slightly, and with the ability of turning on DLSS 3, the RDNA 3 based GPU didn't really stand much of a chance. In Spider-Man, the 7700 XT shows less of an increase in performance compared to the 6700 XT, as it sits just 8% ahead with ray tracing turned on. And while upscaling does help push the numbers up, it's only by 6%, and isn't enough to fend off Nvidia, who clearly have the upper hand, even without frame generation, which just further propels them forward anyway. Though with AMD's frame gen technology coming soon, it will be interesting to see how that matures over time. Watch Dogs Legion was frankly unplayable with ray tracing turned on the 6700 XT, and while it's still within that same remit, a 52% increase on the 7700 XT is very much welcomed. And with some settings being lowered, it's definitely more within reach now, and not that far away from the performance of the RTX 4070, a GPU that is massively more expensive in comparison. Taking a look at the overall averages for ray tracing, and it's clear to see that the 35% uplift from RDNA 2 to RDNA 3 has made a big difference, as the 7700 XT now comes in 10% faster than the RTX 4060 Ti, which, considering Nvidia have held such a monopoly on ray tracing for so long, is definitely becoming more of a level playing field. Though it's very hard to ignore the more powerful 7800 XT, which draws closer to the even more expensive RTX 4070 and sits above 60 FPS in the overall averages for ray tracing. So if we just look at the rasterization performance of the 15 games we tested, what can we take away from the overall performance and what it means for your all-important wallet? Well, it's here that the 7700 XT comes in at $3.52 per frame, which, considering it's the newest card on the market, is actually pretty impressive. Though the 6700 XT and 6750 XT, which both have dropped in price as of late, do offer far superior value for money when looking at the cost per frame, though you will lose out somewhat on sheer FPS. Which is what brings me to the one in between, the 7800 XT, which also launched today and comes in at $3.32. Which is 6% cheaper per frame than the 7700 XT. So remember what I said about bait and switch? It's pretty evident that that could be the case. I mean, don't get me wrong, the 7700 XT is good, but the 7800 XT is, well, better. So what about the rest of the GPU? Design, cooling performance, clock speeds, and all that good stuff. Well, as mentioned, we have 3 cards here today, and it's only fair that I give them some screen time to each of them, starting with the XFX card that we've looked at. Now, from a first glance, the QICK 319 looks pretty identical to the Merc 319 series, but there is some small differences, mainly in terms of the colour. It's all black, and being honest, I prefer it to the silver bezels around the shroud and fans on the Merc series. It's still a long card at 335mm long, 116mm high, and 52mm thick, and coming in at 1270 grams, it's actually quite light in the grand scheme of things. Now, I've said it time and time again, but XFX have definitely steered away from the gamery look that other brands have, and have gone just more simplistic, and it shows. But it also works with its triple fan cooler that includes 2 100mm fans on the outer edges, while a single smaller 90mm fan sits in the middle. What is interesting is how all of the fans spin the same way, which is the opposite to what a lot of brands have been doing as of late with alternating fans. Beyond that, there isn't really much to say about the shroud other than it feels solid even though it's made from plastic, but wraps around the edges of the card in a uniform fashion, which makes the whole card look sleek, and being all black means that it should tie in with any type of system or theme. And then on the side we get our first glimpse of the large heatsink and some subtle XFX and Radeon branding, which is where the full metal backplate wraps around to meet with the front shroud, again finished in black. Now, while the backplate is large, it's actually split into a metal section which covers the entirety of the PCB, while a further section made from plastic continues past the PCB and has an angular cutout for heat to escape from. Though with plenty of ventilation on the backplate, I do wonder if it's necessary. Moving around, the I/O is dual slot and includes 3 DisplayPort connectors and a single HDMI, while the rest of the bracket is taken up by stamped ventilation along with a stamped XFX logo. Then, once we take the card apart, looking at the PCB, there's nothing really out of the ordinary, with a large design that includes 2 columns of VRM circuitry next to the GDDR6 ICs that surround the core itself. There's 2 8-pin power connectors in the top right, which help to power the 14 digital phases and help to provide an extra 20 watts over the reference 7700 XT spec. The phases are split between 8 for the GPU, 2 for the SoC, 2 for the memory, and a further 2 for other components such as the I/O. For cooling, XFX have gone with a large heatsink with a nickel-plated copper cold plate that makes direct contact with the GPU core and memory ICs, and then transfers heat through the 5-6mm heat pipes that span the length of the heatsink. XFX Merc 319 series takes this a little further though, through use of a vapor chamber cooler, but for this series it helps to keep the cost down. The heatsink is extremely large and are what XFX class as a premium aluminium heatsink, with the heat pipes protruding out of the end. And now, while the backplate does help to add rigidity to the PCB and cater for that large heatsink and allow heat to escape, it's not used as a heatsink like we've seen on other models, and instead this is reserved for higher end SKUs from XFX like the Merc 319. All of this combined meant that in this test the temperatures of the GPU peaked at 67 degrees, whilst the hotspot sat around 82 degrees, peaking at 83 degrees. The memory junction temperature peaked at 76 degrees, whilst the fan stayed at a quiet 1100 RPM for the most part, peaking at a slightly louder but still reasonable 1456 RPM. The core clock stayed at around 2660 MHz with a peak of 2731 MHz, whilst the total board power sat at a peak usage of 256 watts. The next card up is the Gigabyte Gaming OC, which is unmistakably familiar. Gigabyte don't change their designs too much and instead use the same cooler for multiple models, and that's the case here with a very large design. It comes in at 302mm long, 130mm high and 56mm thick, and weighs in at 1,510 grams. The Windforce cooling system features 3 90mm fans with unique fins to help push maximum airflow, while the middle fan spins in an opposite direction in an effort to reduce turbulence. There's a small amount of RGB on the top of the card, which is where we'll find some more Gigabyte branding and is the part of the card that you're more likely to see. The backplate covers the entirety of the PCB and, much like other Radeon Gaming OC cards, includes some subtle branding, along with an angled cutout towards the end to help hot air escape. For connectivity, the card has 2 DisplayPort connectors and 2 HDMI ports, and will take up 2 slots inside your case. In terms of the PCB, it's, well, nothing out of the ordinary, with a layout that looks very similar to its bigger brother, the 7800 XT, but of course, with slightly less memory. Towards the right of the PCB, there are 2 8-pin power connectors, as well as a BIOS switch that allows you to switch between OC mode and silent mode. Now, in terms of power delivery, the card features a 14-phase design which are split between 2 for the memory, 8 for the GPU, 2 for the SoC, and a further 2 for other smaller components like the I/O. Now, due to the sheer size of the card, the heatsink is also very large and includes a copper plate which makes direct contact with the GPU core and the VRAM, and then transfers the heat through composite heat pipes away from the main part of the PCB. The heatsink is essentially split into 3 areas, of which the heat pipes pass through, and is surrounded by a solid edge to help with rigidity. What this all means for cooling performance during our hour-long F122 loop test is that the GPU temperatures were actually pretty low, sitting around 55 degrees for the most part, with peaks up to only 57 degrees. The hotspot peaked at 86 degrees, but mostly sat at a slightly cooler 84 degrees, whilst the memory junction temperature stayed at 72 degrees for most of the test. The fans were certainly audible at a peak speed of 2067 RPM and also at 1950 RPM, where the fans sat for most of the test. Our core clock got up to a peak of 2722 MHz, but mostly stayed at around 2650 MHz, all while the total board power was at a pretty steady usage of 257 watts. Lastly, the one I've secretly been wanting to talk about because it's new, the Sapphire 7700 XT Pure. It's new, it's shiny, and it's white, and it just looks extremely clean. While it is on the larger size, it's no bigger than the Gigabyte and XFX cards, coming in at 320mm long, 115mm tall, and 50mm thick, as well as only weighing 1,290 grams, which is pretty light for a GPU these days. Now, in terms of the style, it's frankly gorgeous, and the name is very fitting, Pure, with its pure white design, striking edges, and as always with Sapphire, superior build quality, even down to the 3 large velocity hybrid fans with kind of funky edged blades. There are some accents throughout the card, but other than that, things are kept simple and, well, pure. Even as the front shroud wraps around the top of the card and meets with a backplate. Though I do have one gripe, which comes down to the big block of red plastic on the top. For me, it just stands out like a sore thumb, and also adds a red LED to the middle of the card, but thankfully an LED switch allows you to turn that off easily enough. The backplate is clean, white, and visually stunning too, with simple branding, grey markings, and a small angled set of cutouts on the end to help heat escape from. The I/O will take up 2 slots in your case, though the card is slightly thicker than that, and connectivity wise you get 2 HDMI ports and 2 DisplayPort connectors, so I guess pretty standard stuff. Now, taking the card apart is relatively simple, and the PCB is pretty standard in comparison to what we've seen on other 7700 XT models. There are 2 8-pin power connectors on the top right of the PCB, and that all-important LED switch positioned just on the side. In terms of power delivery, the card features 14 phases as part of the setup, which again is very similar to what we've seen on other models, split with 8 for the GPU, 2 for the memory, 2 for the SoC, and 2 for other various components, which is exactly the same setup as Sapphire's 7800 XT Nitro Plus card as well. The heatsink spans longer than the PCB and sits nicely between the backplate and the fans, with the PCB sandwiched beneath, with a cold plate that makes direct contact with the GPU core and the memory, while separate plates assist cooling to the VRMs. The heatsink itself is split into 2 sections, which are separated by heat pipes which take heat away to either end of the large blocks, away from the main part of the card. What all of this means in terms of cooling performance is that when we booted up F122 for an hour-long loop, is that the GPU temperature had a reasonably low peak at 60 degrees, but sat a degree lower at 59 degrees for most of the test. Whilst the hotspot shot up to 83 degrees as peak, but sat at 82 for most of the test. The memory junction temperature stayed and peaked at 78 degrees throughout the test, while the core clock was mostly around 2630 MHz in this test, but it did peak a little bit higher at 2690 MHz, all whilst the fan span at around 1420 RPM, which led to a fairly quiet card that used a total board power of 239 watts. So, 3 cards, 3 very different designs, but this is the big one. As the RX 7700 XT is coming in at $449, it puts it in a really awkward price category that's more expensive than some but cheaper than others. And with kind of not much between it and the RX 7800 XT, I fear it's going to be a bit of a hard sell, especially as the 7800 XT is the better card in terms of performance for only $50 more. Now, one beauty is that the XFX card we looked at today is going to hit that $449 price tag, and I feel you do get a lot of card, which is more than capable of keeping things under control in the temperature and cooling department, while also looking stylish. Obviously, the Sapphire is going to be a little bit more because it is white, and then the Gigabyte, again, is going to be even more. For me, I'm torn. I really like the 7700 XT because it does give a good uplift from the previous generation, and also sits at a price segment that really doesn't have any competition. But then AMD have come along and beaten it down a little with its bigger brother, the 7800 XT. And I get it, because if the 7800 XT was more expensive, it wouldn't make any sense. But with $50 separating the two, it is a tough one. I guess you could say that if your budget is $450 and not a penny more, then it is the wisest and smartest choice. But if you can stretch a little further, then the 7800 XT is a no-brainer. But then somewhere in between you have the more kind of, let's say, exotic models as well. Now, in comparison to Nvidia, it has really shown how out of touch Team Green is with kind of the whole audience and general consumer base. And even with the price drops on the RX 6700 and 6700 XT from AMD, this newer card still comes in pretty damn favourable. Sure, the older cards offer superior bang for buck in terms of cost per frame, but a newer product will always be that little bit higher because you have to pay the early adopter tax. But it's not actually that much more. And with frame generation on the horizon, I feel that the 7700 XT is only going to get even better as time goes on. And it's kind of, been allowed some time to mature, much like most AMD products have done historically. So the big question, should you buy one? Yes, but also no. Like I mentioned, if you're on a strict budget, then it's a bit of a no-brainer. And compared to the competition, it is a clear winner, as there really isn't any competition other than themselves. The 4060 Ti is subpar in comparison, even if cheaper, and the RTX 4070 is too expensive in comparison. If you do have that extra cash, and we're only talking about a coffee a day for the best part of 2 weeks, then skip this and just get the 7800 XT instead, even if it is fantastically average. And that about wraps this one up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you get access to a whole host of goodies, including bi-weekly game night, exclusive behind the scenes content, special air on our Discord, and so much more. The link for all that great stuff is, as always, down below. And with that, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.